With that, like I said, let's jump into the message, concluding our series titled, The Root of the Restless, Part 5, Addicted to More. Once again, Root of the Restless, Part 5, Addicted to More. Now, essentially, if you've been here any of the last few weeks, you know that we've been really talking about restlessness. And the reason being is a lot of this comes from Hebrews 11 and 12. There's an interesting kind of language that changes about the promised land. And what I mean by that is there's like linguistic difference between Old Testament, the physical promised land, and New Testament, kind of this mysterious terminology that shows up. And what I mean by that is essentially the author of Hebrews says because of their disobedience, and it's referenced a few times, because of their disobedience, they could not enter into my rest. And it becomes this theme of essentially that ultimately, because of their disobedience and sinful lifestyle, that they never entered into the rest that God had prepared for them. Now, once again, right, it's interesting because the Old Testament, we don't really have that phrasing, meaning the promised land, not called the promised land, but the place of rest. In the New Testament, it's this understanding that as we follow God, He's the one who leads us to a place in which we would rest and find peace and delight in who He is. And so with that, we've been talking about, because in all honesty, as a pastor of this church and somebody who's been in ministry now 15 years, what I can tell you is this: restlessness is not something that's just in the secular. I would even venture to say that restlessness is at an incredibly high level, really from COVID onward, in the sacred. And what I mean by that is we're constantly inundated with information, with comparison, which is what we talked about last week, is we're constantly reminded of the best of others while thinking about the worst of ourselves. It is in that place that a restlessness seeps into our souls. And so if any of these, or if today inspires you, you can go back and listen on any podcast platform this series, and hopefully you're inspired to maybe make some self-inventory, and hopefully some changes that you would find rest that you seek. Because ultimately, that's what the promised land is that we all want. Because if I were to ask you, what's your promised land look like? You might be able to describe a house, a job, a family, an amount of Bugattis, right? But all of these things are physical. Because many of us, we think if we get to a physical place with physical possessions, a physical domain, that in that physical aspect, that spiritually or mentally we'll find rest. And I'll say this: your rest will never be confined or defined by an outside reality, but an interior disposition and revelation. And so today, like I said, we're going to be continuing our talk with our final week, Addicted to More. Now, I did really good not prefacing, because last week we talked about the chronic condition of comparison. And really what we did is kind of look at it through the lens of understanding what comparison does to the human soul. And really it's actually an issue of mistrust in God's goodness as we look at God's blessing on others. But today what we're going to spend time on is actually what I believe all of us deep down, what comparison is rooted in. Somebody has more than me. They have more. And in that place of constantly being reminded about the more of everybody around you, it's easy to become addicted to the more of a lifestyle that says, I have to continue to accumulate, because what I accumulate will define me. I have to continue to reach for the next thing. I can never stop. I can never rest. I've always got to be grinding. I've always got to have 9,000 side hustles. And I'm not saying this is inherently bad, because what I'm not going to sit here and tell you to do is not have a work ethic, to not be faithful, to not be consistent. But if your entire life is wrapped up in more, you will be restless for your entire life as well. You know, if you didn't know this about me, I'm a huge kind of World War II, World War I, really all the wars, Civil War. I'm listening to a Revolutionary War run right now. I like to listen on audiobooks at the gym to just different history, because I read a decent amount, and so I needed kind of a genre that was outside of like spiritual biblical commentary lens, like more of a shut-off valve, how you will. And so I don't like podcasts either, because believe it or not, 95% of people who talk on a mic doesn't mean they should have a mic. Like some people are like, man, I listen to this podcast. I'm like, I've heard 3 things from that, and I would never listen to that guy. Right? It's like, just because podcasts are a thing doesn't mean everybody should be doing. Anyway, so I don't really listen to podcasts. Sorry. Some people are like, well, a little jaded there. No, it's okay. But I say that to say that I really enjoy audiobooks. And one of the audiobooks I was listening to recently was doing there was a commentary essentially on drug use in Nazi Germany during World War II. And essentially, if you didn't know this, there's kind of this fascinating, what really inspired the mobilization and the mass takeover of Europe that the Nazis achieved in such a short time, that really in history had never before been seen on that level in Europe that fast, was what was called the Blitzkrieg, which is mechanized warfare, meaning tanks and mobilized artillery that could literally just run. So it'd run through the front lines, or it would go through the border, and it wouldn't stop. It would just keep going. Now, many of us are like, okay, but obviously when it got dark out, they'd have to stop. No, literally what made the Blitzkrieg famous is for days, they wouldn't stop. They would just go and go and go. That's why the fall of France was extremely short amount of time for the millions of people that it affected, because ultimately they ran all the way straight into the capital. Now, some of us are like, how is it that you could drive tanks for days, cars for days, never stop, never rest, keep going, take more land, take more land, take more land, and then ultimately overthrow all these countries? One word: meth. It's actually widely chronicled now, you can look it up on your own, that there was a synthetic methamphetamine developed for the Nazis right before the first country ever fell, Poland. 35 million Pervitin tablets. It's the only record we have of it throughout the war. It was just produced. I should not say this. Literally, there was somebody who, when I said that in the beginning about soldiers going for 3 days or a week, she's like, man, like, yes, you absolutely can, because when I was on meth, that's true. Like, texted me after. She's like, that's a real thing. I'm like, man, you got a sick testimony, my friend. But literally, it's just crazy, because you start researching, you see before any of the conquest takes place, 35 million Pervitin tablets, this is synthetic methamphetamine, is developed in one of the largest laboratories in Berlin at the time, and then assimilated to all the army. Why? Because an army that can't be stopped won't stop. And this becomes what really defines the first era of World War II, is a military that just, from a more standpoint, had more manpower, everything in their path. Tanks that could go longer than everybody else, and their more ran through everything in their path until it didn't anymore. And what's interesting is this. See, we see that soldiers could march for days without sleep. You can do your own research on this. Tank divisions would drive through normal human exhaustion. Pilots, which is crazy to think about, would stay awake beyond human limits, running 48 to 72 hours straight, only landing to refuel. At first, it looked like unbelievable, invincible power. At first, it made the Nazis look unstoppable in a way that history could not quantify. At first, it looked like the more that they had produced was working at a level that mankind had not seen. More movement, more speed, more conquest, more productivity, more victory. But eventually, the very thing that made them feel invincible became the thing that was their undoing. Because when you build a life on artificial strength, eventually the bill comes due. The crash comes. The paranoia sets in. The instability comes. The depletion of bone-sapping energy being gone. See, I believe that this has become a picture of the modern soul. We have become so addicted to more noise, more scrolling, more success, more consumption, more stimulation, more dopamine, more outrage, more achievement. We are chemically, emotionally, digitally, spiritually overclocking ourselves. But the way of Jesus is not frantic escalation. The way of Jesus is abiding. Jesus, as the fate of mankind rests on him, is unhurried, not sprinting to prove himself. For while the world is fueled by anxiety and adrenaline, the kingdom is fueled through proximity and the presence of God. Not addicted to more, but attached to presence. Not manufacturing strength, but consuming daily bread. Not living beyond our limits, but being rooted like a tree planted by streams of water. Some of us are exhausted because we are trying to sustain with adrenaline and cultural ambition a life that was only meant to be sustained by the Spirit of God. With that, let's jump into some verses before anybody gets mad. We're going to be looking in Matthew 14, Matthew 15, and then comparing and contrasting it to Exodus 16. These are three specific stories that take place in a way that has the same situation, setting, and I would even say circumstance taking place that ultimately shows the redemptive arc and nature of the God that we serve. The first story, the feeding of the 5,000, let's jump into really quickly. It says this. Now, when Jesus heard about John being his cousin who had just been murdered, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them, healing their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late, so send the crowds away that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." I want you to notice on desolate there, desolate means a place nothing grows, a place that has been abandoned and deserted, right? And if you know, this is the Middle East, meaning that it's most likely quite literally a desert. Continuing on, verse 16, it says, "But Jesus said to them, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. And they all ate and were satisfied. They picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 full baskets. There were about 5,000 men who ate that day, besides women and children." Now, there's going to be 2 stories we read, and you need to understand something actually very unique about each one. So the first one, geographically, we know is centralized to the area of Bethesda, meaning that this audience is an audience of Jewish followers of Jesus. Meaning that this entire crowd most likely has a basic understanding and knowledge of the prophecies of the Messiah, as well as the understanding of religious custom. Now, I tell you that because essentially what's taking place that's fascinating is that it says that Jesus multiplies in the desert, and then there's 12 baskets left over. Now, first thing you need to realize, obviously, is that they ate and were satisfied, which is big later on, we'll see in Exodus. But even more than that, that there's leftovers, but also the symbolism of what has been left over, 12 baskets. Why would 12 be significant to somebody who is of Jewish custom and culture? Not because of the 12 disciples, but because of the 12 tribes. 12 tribes, meaning every Jew could literally tell you what tribe they were born into. Jesus not only feeds them in the desert, satisfies them in the desert, he has enough left over for 12 basketfuls, almost summarizing that I have enough of my power to have leftovers and satisfaction for all the tribes. Continuing on, though, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Matthew 15, 29 through 39. This is a feeding of the 4,000 that takes place in what was the Decapolis area, which is a Greek, mostly Gentile. Gentile is a term that means other nation, meaning they were not born into the 12 tribes. And ultimately, Jesus, in his own way, even though they're not necessarily the focus of his ministry, is leaving breadcrumb trails, no pun intended, leading kind of to them. Man, I thought that was funnier, but leading them to the point in which they would come to know that they have access to God as well. Now, let's read really quick this story, the feeding of the 4,000. It says this: Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he came up a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and they laid him at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples and said, I have compassion for these people. They've been with me 3 days and have had nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, where can we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? 7, they replied, and a few small fishes. He took the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he'd given thanks, he broke them, gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were then satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up that number, 7, very different than 12, 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. After Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into the boat and went to the vicinity of Maggots. Now, once again, we know that this is predominantly a Gentile area that Jesus is in. What's fascinating, though, is the first story, we have a Jewish area and 12 baskets left over. This one, we have a Gentile area, 7 baskets left over. Now, biblically speaking, there's a theme that you always see around the number 7. 7 is the number of completion that we see scripturally as a numeric kind of meaning behind when that number is used. Meaning that if I were to summarize these 2 stories, essentially the first one is Jesus, I have an abundance and satisfaction for the 12 tribes of me. And then I have a completion for the Gentile who has no clue who I even am. That in Jesus, there is abundance and there is completion, all tied to the satisfaction of what he gives to us. Now, I told you we had one more because ultimately we know that in the New Testament, the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000 is very obviously famous. But in the Old Testament, this isn't the first time that God has fed people in the wilderness. We see in the Old Testament that God feeds people in the wilderness, his people in the wilderness. And we're going to pick that up because I think that the redemptive arc of this story, of these stories, has more to do with your present day reality than you think. Let's jump into Exodus 16. Once again, we're going to start in 1 through 7, then jump down to verse 14 and close it out. And by close out our reading, and then I'll give you 92 points. It says this, then they sent out from Elim, and all of the congregations of the son of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month of the departure from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, where we sat by pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into the wilderness to kill us, this whole assembly, with hunger. Now, if you notice, very different place in the story, right? Jesus actually discerns that the people are hungry. We don't have a recollection in Matthew that the people were chanting, Subway, Subway. So, no, like literally it says that Jesus is like, hey, I'm not going to send these people away. They're probably starving, right? He asks his disciples, can you feed them? They're like, what are you talking about, right? But in this story, what we see is immediately the people are grumbling and complaining. And what are they grumbling and complaining about? That the place that they just left, Egypt, had food that met their needs. I've read this quite often, and actually there's a favorite phrasing I wrote a while ago about in a newsletter for us here at our church. In another passage, I believe it's in Deuteronomy, the people look at Moses and they're like, we had pomegranates in Egypt. What are you doing? We're getting tired of this. And I've always thought deeply about this passage. And the deep thought I have for you, it has really nothing to do with our sermon, but it has a lot to do with your understanding of more. Would you rather have food that stuffs you, but be a slave, or be free and a little bit in discomfort and hungry, waiting for God to meet your need? Because I think this actually is probably the clearest place we have to start our conversation of more. Many of us, the reason we have more, or we crave more, is because we just want to be satisfied in our natural craving. And ultimately, trust requires such a level of discomfort that we'd rather be in bondage but have our cravings met than walking in faith and having to trust God that in his time and in his way, he'll bring the nourishment for our souls. Continuing on, it says this, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. The people shall go out gathering a day's portion every day that I may test them whether or not they will walk in my instruction. Notice the language is a little different. Jesus is like, I'm going to pray, we'll break it, start handing it out. We got a ton left over, right? This one, the people are grumbling and complaining. Then Moses comes to him and says, we're going to rain manna down, but here's the deal. You have to listen and follow instruction. And here's the level of the instruction. It says on the 6th day, when they were preparing what they had to bring in, it will be twice as much that you gather that day. I love this because I would even say this. The test of if you're restless or not is if you can actually rest. Meaning that the promise of God is I will reign for 5 days, enough for you to survive every single day. On the 6th day, I'm going to give you enough for 2 days so that you can wake up and have a full 24-hour period in which you just rest from work. Now, I say that because in our commoditized economy, right, our time is our greatest currency. Yes, we think it's money, but it's time and it's attention that is, from a monetization sense, what our economy has been built on. I did a breakdown on this a while ago where, like, you can actually take some of the largest oil exporters in the world, put them all together, and they still would not be worth what search engines are worth on the in terms of overall worth of the company. Why? Because literally oil we need to function, but attention is so marketable. It is so able to be commoditized that literally it is more valuable than the oil in your car. So with that, right, essentially Jesus is saying, I want you to be able to rest from everything and trust me. These are some of the instructions. Continuing onward, it says this. So Moses and Aaron said to the sons of Israel, at evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against him. And what are we that you grumble against us? Jump down to verse 14 once again. It says this, when the layer of dew evaporated, behold, on the surface of the wilderness there was fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the sons of Aaron saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. In the New Testament, it actually says that they ate the bread of heaven. It was sweet as the bread of heaven. Continuing on in verse 16, it says, this is what the Lord had commanded. Gather of it every man as much as he should eat. You shall take an omer apiece according to the number of persons each of you has in his tent. An omer was the unit of measurement. Verse 17, the sons of Israel did so. Some gathered much, some little. When they measured it with an omer, he who had gathered much had no excess. He who had gathered little had no lack. Every man gathered as much as he should eat. Moses said to them, let no man leave any of it until morning. But they did not listen to Moses, and some left part of it out in the morning, and it bred worms and became foul. Moses was angry with them. They gathered it morning by morning, every man as much as he should eat, but when the sun grew hot, it would melt. Now, essentially, there's some phrasing there that I want to make sure I unpack fully. Essentially, they would gather enough for the day, and if you kind of compare translations, it says if they gathered more than what they intended to use the day and put it in the tent, it would mold, rot, and produce worms. So essentially, he's saying, hey, we're going to give you enough to survive every single day, and you're going to have to wake up every morning trusting that when you wake up, I'll provide for you that day. And on the 6th day, you're going to have to trust that I'm going to provide for you for 2 days. Now, if you think about these two stories, they're very, very different, but the settings are extremely similar. Desert, deserted places in which they don't have food to survive. Their appetites are like, what are we going to do for nourishment? And in both of these stories, it's very different what God does. Now, I say that because I'm going to tie it all together, hopefully, for you today to understand. See, our problem with more, as a culture, as a society, as followers of Jesus, is we have an Old Testament understanding of how our New Testament God works. In Exodus, they gathered for themselves, and if they gathered too much, they found maggots. Striving to keep the law, they failed over and over, never having more than what they needed that day. In Matthew, they not only were given food, they were satisfied by the food they were given, and they had leftovers. We too sometimes adopt an Old Testament mentality in a New Testament day and age, thinking it is us who must gather. It is us who must stack as much as possible. And we don't trust. And instead of going to Jesus, we go to ourselves, not realizing that our more will grow more, accumulate in the desert humanity of our day-to-day existence, will grow moldy in the soul if it isn't tied to the abundance and completion of life in God. There is only really one difference besides the geographical location of all of these stories. And the one difference is this: Jesus. Exodus, Jesus isn't there. It's Moses and Aaron. But essentially the demand and the requirement is follow the instruction. Trust me every morning. Gather enough for your day. But the New Testament revelation we have is this: if we will be close enough to Jesus to hear his voice, listen to his instruction, reach for what his hands can produce, open our hands to what we have in them, in that place, satisfaction. In that place, nourishment. In that place, leftover. There is only one difference between these two stories: Jesus. Meaning, what am I trying to say? That ultimately, if you're trying to produce a more in your life in which Jesus is absent from that more, don't be surprised if it turns out to be moldy and with some maggots in it. Today, I want to talk about how to make sure the more you want isn't moldy. How do you make sure the more isn't moldy? Because I believe all of us, I hope that you have dreams, hopes, aspirations, and faith for the goodness of God on your life. What I also hope happens is you're not praying prayers for God to do things that the moment he starts doing them, you stop talking to him. Because I've been a pastor long enough, and that would be my number one request. You come up to me and you say, hey, will you pray for me? My response, if God gave you that, would you say another word to him? If God did do the desires of your heart, would your heart still belong to him? If God answered the prayer that you have, would you still pray to him? Because that's what relationship does. Recognizes that the bread is great for a day, but I don't need bread. I need the hand that miraculously multiplies it. That the bread is not just for my appetite or my nourishment. The satisfaction and the rest and the peace is what I am after. And ultimately, sadly, in the church today, the sacred has become as restless as the secular. Why? Because we want to be God. Because culture's told us we can become gods. I am completely content with admitting that I am not a good God. That I will not be a good God for myself. And I'd rather follow the voice in the wilderness, even if it is dry, dirty, and as deserted as it can be, because I know a God that can produce from his place and not mine. So with that, how to make sure the more isn't moldy. Number one is this: your more is connected to your present proximity to Jesus. And if it's not, it will be moldy. They had to be following and listening in order to receive the nourishment. It was not yesterday's following. It was today's following. Notice, present proximity. I don't care what you did 10 years ago. I don't care about yesterday's faithfulness. Today, does God have my today? Does God have my right now? Does God have the moments of my life? Not the Sinai you got the tablets on when you were 23 that defined your life forever. No, does he have the faithfulness and the obedience of surrendered, laid down life that says, I value your word, your way, and my proximity to you in my day-to-day existence? Because when Jesus is your source, abundance stops being your savior. And many of us, our theology is we claim we have a Savior, but the Savior we really seek and worship is abundance. Meaning when I get there, that's my promised land. No, your promised land is when you can actually rest. And if you're producing a promised land that won't produce rest, you're producing a promised land that's going to be a little moldy. Mold is what happens when trust is replaced by control. We are not in control. We aren't in control. In fact, the older you get and the more kids you have, the more you realize it's over. Number two is this: your more is connected to his hands, not yours. And if it's not, you're gonna be moldy. If you notice both stories, what does he say? He says, you guys go do it. And then he says, what do we have? What do we have? And then it defines what we have. But then what takes place is this. When there's an awareness of what we have and what we lack, which is what is happening, there then becomes a question right after. Bring it to me. Place it in my hand. Many of us, we are keenly aware of what we lack. We're also keenly aware that I ain't trying to place already what I don't feel like I have into his hands. Bro, it's already slipping through my hands. And I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about everything. Every part of our soul, every part of our humanity, every part of our brokenness. It is so easy for God to say, just put it in my hands. And we're like, bro, I can barely even open my hand to give it to you, my dog. And what am I trying to get at? Because ultimately, Jesus, before he could ever multiply, before he could ever repurpose, before he could ever bring nourishment, before there was ever satisfaction, before there was ever leftover, there was, will you put it in my hand? The kingdom is not built on stockpiling. It's built on dependence. Your reason and logic can dress up or dress down spiritual principles all you want. But the question is, do you trust his hands over yours? Work hard, absolutely. But don't neglect God in the pursuit of becoming God in your own world every day. And I think this is the sad thing, is we become in our success, in our accolade, in our affirmation, it is so easy to become a God or become a person who doesn't need God but can sprinkle enough God that appeases our senses. I'm telling you, every day is a question. Do I bring my fish and loaves? You've heard it said here over and over, and I'll close today's service with it because it is paramount to who we are. Do I depend my time, my attention, my resource? Do I take the loaves that I need to survive of time? Do I take the loaves and the fish of the attention that I have that I don't feel like I have enough of and put them in his hand? Do I take the resources that I know I don't have enough of and put them in his hands? In that place, I'm telling you, his hands will multiply. And I don't know if they'll multiply the way that you want. And that's ultimately, I would say, the first hurdle you're going to have to clear is when you're placing things in his hands and he's revealing idolatry, not multiplication. He's revealing comfort, not sanctification. I ain't getting too many amens. We just got quiet on that one, right? Because we all been there where the timing didn't get met. What we wanted didn't get, in fact, it got way harder. Bro, you got to follow him into the desert before you get multiplication in these stories. Many of us, man, I want the provision of God, but man, I ain't about that instruction though, my dog. Number 3, your more is connected to his words. And if you don't know him, don't be surprised if the more ends up moldy. He prays, then is multiplied. He gives thanks, and there is multiplication. He blesses the food, and it is multiplied. Why am I telling you that? Because the miracle followed his words, not their effort. The bread multiplied after he spoke, not before it. You can't have God's provision without following God's instruction. And I think deep down, that's a war all of us are going to have to face. I'm not going to carry that cross for you because I'm responsible for my life and my family. And I'm going to speak with as much conviction and as straightforward as I can. But I will tell you this, if you're going to pray for provision over and over and over and never own a level of saying yes to instruction, provision is going to be hard to see come to pass. The blessing wasn't in the bread. The blessing was in the voice that blessed the bread and multiplied it. Because his voice is the difference between multiplication and mold. My last point, number 4, is this. Some of you thought I was only going to do 2 to 3 lines for all these points. Bro, if you're a Fixate person, you know, right? People are like, dang, you got short points today. No, I was saving it. Some people are like, everybody laughing, y'all are regulars because everybody knows. So like, oh, these are really punchy, cool. It's like, oh, there it is, a Dead Sea Scroll. Number 4, only Jesus brings more that satisfies. A people whose disobedience in the wilderness and sin was rooted in seeking their own satisfaction now find in the wilderness a man providing satisfaction. People who, when they tried to gather more, only were met with mold and maggots. now have leftovers that don't spoil. The difference between more that satisfies and has leftover versus mold and maggots? Jesus. Is Jesus my source of more? My trust for more? My ambition filtered through his reasoning for more? My understanding of more surrender to his more? Because if not, it's not more. It's maggots and it's mold. The difference between more that satisfies and more that rots? One thing. Jesus. Your proximity to Jesus. Meaning if all of your ambition, all of your drive, all of your focus is on a more for a kingdom that you control, that's going to be a moldy one. The miracle wasn't merely that everyone ate, because in the Old Testament, everybody ate. The miracle was that everybody was satisfied. The miracle was that there was left over for God's people. See, the difference between the wilderness of Exodus and the wilderness of Matthew is not the location. It's the presence of Jesus. And I hope that you train yourself to realize that it is his presence, his proximity, his word, his hand that is your multiplication. It is not more hours that you could put in. It's not, okay, and once again, I'm not talking about hard work not being important. I'm not talking about being a driven individual, but if it's for a more in which your kingdom becomes secure, more comfortable, more compromised, what is the more? Because I'll tell you this, the Nazis had superhuman strength and had so much victory historically, but that didn't turn out well. You know, I have had this revelation I've been sitting on, and I'm probably going to turn it into something a little bit more long form, but this is kind of our landing the plane moment. If you think about it, some of us feel the tension right now of I know what the word says, I know what the instruction is, I know what I should be doing, right? And I want to reframe and kind of challenge context. If you think about the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, there was no law. There was no 10 Commandments. There was only really one thing: relationship and intimacy. If you notice, when there was, hey, don't eat of this tree, walk with me. If you think about that, right? What am I trying to introduce as a thought to you? What if relationship and intimacy, if lived properly, would bring about such a conviction and a morality that thinking you need to devote 10 billion hours to the Bible, all of a sudden you've just gone close enough to the Spirit of God in your day-to-day rhythmic life that you know what to do, that you respond in morality and conviction, that intimacy has produced such a proximity that sees blessing, that ultimately, just as the New Testament says, they were uncommon and uneducated men that they saw had been with Jesus. What am I trying to get at? See, some of us, we hear a sermon like this and we're like, well, God's only had God's only had kind of a tiny sliver. Like, how am I supposed to catch up to this? How am I supposed to get to this level? And ultimately, Adam and Eve were brought into a world that God just invited them. Would you walk with me? Don't eat of this tree and walk with me. I'll even say this today. Maybe right now you know of one thing inhibiting your walk right now, in which God's saying, walk with me. And just as he said about Adam and Eve, don't eat of that tree, he's saying of you today, will you trust as you rhythmically walk with me and don't choose the one thing you know is wrong, that there'll be life for you, that there'll be satisfaction, that there'll be rest. And over time, once again, that rhythmic proximity produces a conviction and morality, not based in I have a PhD in biblical studies, but I have a living relationship with the God of heaven on earth. See, what am I challenging you into today? Would you be somebody who recognizes that it's not your hands that are going to multiply? Yes, are you talented? Yes, can God do great things? Or can you do great things? Absolutely. But what would it look like to live in such a profound way? And I'm going to say this extremely pointed. In such a profound way that the only thing you could ever say about your life is God gets all the credit and glory. I've lived in such a way, I'm going to challenge you in my literally final landing here. I think the reason deconstruction or people walk away from their faith is that ultimately, when we live in such a way rhythmically and proximation-wise, we're depending on God, dependence in such a deep, like, God, you have to come through. When he does, it's very hard to walk away from that relationship when you recognize what the source is. It's very hard to choose your own hands when you've seen his hands multiply. It's very hard for you to choose a desert without him versus a desert with him, because you've seen what he can produce in the desolate. See, what am I challenging you into? Would you trust that his more is better than whatever your idea of more is? Would you stand to your feet today? As is our practice and custom here, I invite you, would you bow your heads and close your eyes? In Scripture, it says to be still and know that I am God. That is something we take literal here, meaning that we create stillness in all of our services. That we might be able to take self-inventory and say, God, what is it that you want to speak? What is it that you maybe want to say? Or just say, God, I'm still. Would you whisper to my heart? We're going to take a minute or two of stillness and silence, and then we'll recite the Lord's Prayer and worship with one final song. Let's be still.